Once you've built your roof, you can establish the height of your fascia, fix the fascia on, and start constructing the eave. But before you do so, you have to determine the eave drop off. The fascia position and eave drop off is determined prior to fixing the fascia in place. This is preferably calculated to eliminate discrepancies caused by bowed rafter tails, which can produce an excessive or insufficient eave drop off. Eave drop off is the term used to describe the vertical distance measured from the top of the top plate to the underside of the eave lining for boxed eaves. This diagram indicates how eave drop off is measured for a boxed eave. As you can see, it's measured from the top of the top plate of the frame to the underside of the eave lining. To determine the eave drop off for fascia that falls away from the frame, the following information is required. You'll need to know the roof pitch, the eave width, the dimensions of the fascia, the type of roofing, the rafter left on dimension, and the batten height. And in addition to that, for fascia that rises away from the frame, you'll also need to know the wall frame width. The roof pitch is the angle or slope of the roof. This is expressed as degrees. The roof pitch is also the common rafter level bevel angle. The roof pitch affects the eave drop off. The eave drop off increases as the roof pitch increases, and the eave drop off decreases as the roof pitch decreases. Eave width is the eave dimension measured level or horizontally from the frame to the inside of the fascia. It's usually indicated on the building plan, but it's important to note plans for brick veneer buildings show the eave width measured from the outside of the brick wall to the inside of the fascia. In these cases, the actual eave width will have to be calculated as follows. The calculation is done by adding the eave width that is indicated on the plan to the width of the brick used for the job and the cavity used for the job. So if your eave width shown on the plan is 600 millimeters and you're using a standard brick, which is 110, and a standard cavity of 40 millimeters, adding those together would give you an actual eave width of 750 millimeters. When considering the dimensions of the fascia for your eave drop off, there are two critical dimensions that you must consider. The first dimension is the distance from the top of the fascia to the bottom of the groove, and the second is the thickness of the fascia. This diagram shows the effect that the distance from the top of the fascia to the bottom of the groove has on the eave drop off. The fascia thickness affects the eave drop off because as the fascia increases in thickness, the fascia must be lowered to fit within the line of the Belcast. This in turn increases the eave drop off. There are two types of fascia, metal fascia and timber fascia. These will differ in section size. The height and thickness will differ, and the position of the groove will also differ. Timber fascia is 180 millimeters high, but it comes in a couple of thicknesses, 25 millimeters thick and 20 millimeters thick. The groove is generally 20 to 25 millimeters measured up from the bottom of the fascia. Metal fascia is generally 180 to 185 millimeters high by 35 millimeters thick. Its groove is generally 10 to 15 millimeters measured up from the bottom of the fascia. This slide indicates how to determine the critical dimensions of fascia, where the fascia is 180 millimeters high, 25 millimeters thick, and the groove is 20 millimeters up from the bottom of the fascia. To determine the critical height, or what we call fascia drop-off, we take the height of the fascia, which is 180 millimeters high, and you subtract the distance from the bottom of the groove to the bottom of the fascia, which is 20 millimeters. So the fascia drop-off for this fascia is 180 minus 20, which is 160 millimeters, and the other critical dimension is the thickness of the fascia, which is 25 millimeters. This slide shows how to determine the critical dimension for metal fascia, where the fascia is 180 millimeters high, 35 millimeters thick, and the groove is 10 millimeters up from the bottom of the fascia. To determine the critical fascia drop-off, it's simply the height of the fascia of 180 millimeters minus the distance from the bottom of the fascia to the bottom of the groove, which is 10 millimeters. So the fascia drop-off would be 180 minus 10, which is 170 millimeters. And the second critical dimension is the thickness of the fascia, which is 35 millimeters. Belcast is a term given to the distance the fascia projects above the top of the rafter. As the belcast increases, the eave drop-off decreases. And as the belcast decreases, the eave drop-off increases. The height of the belcast is governed by two things. One, the height of the roof batten, and two, the type of roof covering. Thicker battens will require a higher belcast. Thinner battens require a lower belcast. Where metal roofing is used, a 5mm gap between the metal roofing and the fascia is required. This is so the metal roofing doesn't rub onto the fascia and cause it to corrode and the roof to leak. So to calculate the belcasts for a metal roof, it is simply the batten thickness minus 5mm. If the batten thickness is 50 millimeters, it's 50 minus 5, therefore the belcast would be 45 millimeters. This diagram shows a metal roof where the batten thickness is 50 millimeters and the belcast has been reduced to 45 millimeters to maintain the 5mm gap between the fascia and the metal roofing. Where roof tiles are used, the first roof tile rests on top of the fascia, so the belcast must be set to maintain the correct angle for the tiles. So the height of the belcast must equal the batten thickness plus one roof tile thickness. If the batten thickness is 35 millimeters and the roof tile is 10 millimeters, the belcast must be 45 millimeters. This diagram shows a roof tile scenario where the batten thickness is 35 millimeters, the roof tile thickness is 10 millimeters, and the belcast height has been set correctly at 45 millimeters to maintain the correct angle of the roof tiles. This diagram is indicative of what happens when the belcast is set too low for a tiled roof. This diagram is indicative of what happens when the belcast is set too high for a tiled roof. Once all these factors are considered and the eave drop-off is correctly determined, the fascia will be fixed in position with the correct belcast. There is a method to determine the fascia position for each of the following. 1. Fascia that falls from the frame, and 2. Fascia that rises from the frame. When determining eave drop-off, which we'll call X, the method used depends whether the fascia is attached to a rafter tail that either falls away from the wall plate or rises away from the wall plate. The diagram on the left indicates where a fascia rises away from the frame, and the diagram on the right indicates where the fascia falls away from the frame. The following method is for fascia that falls from the frame. The formula for this method is fall A plus bracket B minus C close bracket equals X. X being the eave drop-off. The reason we determine eave drop-off in this way is because it's the easiest and most consistent way of determining the fascia position. That way we can determine what the eave drop-off is and measure down from the top plate to establish our fascia position. Fall A is the initial drop-off. It's indicated by the yellow triangle. It is the rise of that triangle. B is the fascia drop-off. The fascia drop-off was mentioned earlier when determining the critical dimensions for the fascia. It is the dimension from the top of the fascia to the bottom of the groove in the fascia. C is the height above top plate. This includes the rafter left on dimension and the distance measured plumb from the top of the rafter to the Belcast line. Once X is measured down from the top plate and marked on the frame, it can then be levelled across to establish the position of the bottom of the groove of the fascia. For A, the initial drop-off, can be calculated with trigonometry using the eave width, fascia thickness, and the roof pitch. For this scenario, the eave width is 450 mm wide, the fascia thickness is 25 mm thick, and the roof pitch is 10 degrees. The initial drop-off would be calculated by adding the eave width and fascia thickness together, and then by using the formula for tan as follows. So once we add the eave width of 450 mm and the fascia thickness of 25 mm, we have a dimension of 475 mm. We then calculate the initial drop-off using the formula for tan. The formula for tan equals opposite divided by the adjacent. Tan relates to the angle, 10 degrees, so tan 10 degrees equals the opposite, which we don't know, it's going to be the rise of that yellow triangle, divided by 475. But because opposite is the unknown, we need to convert the formula so that the opposite equals the adjacent multiplied by tan. So now we have 475 multiplied by tan 10 degrees. And opposite equals 83.8. We would round up to, say, 84 millimeters. The initial drop-off is 84 millimeters. B, fascia drop-off. As described previously, this is the distance from the top of the fascia to the bottom of the groove in the fascia. For this scenario, the fascia is 180 millimeters high, and the distance from the bottom of the fascia to the bottom of the groove in the fascia is 20 millimeters. So to determine the fascia drop-off, it is the height of the fascia of 180 millimeters minus the distance from the bottom of the groove to the bottom of the fascia, which is 20 millimeters, which gives us a fascia drop-off of 160 millimeters. C, height above top plate. This distance can be calculated with trigonometry using the batten depth, allowance for gap for a metal roof, roof tile thickness for a tiled roof, and the roof pitch, plus the rafter left on measurement. This example is for C, height above top plate, for a tiled roof. To calculate the height above top plate for a tiled roof, you need to know the batten depth, the tile thickness, the roof pitch, and the left on measurement. The rafter left on measurement can be measured directly off the rafter or truss. It is the plumb measurement above the bird's mouth of the rafter, or the plumb measurement at the foot of the truss. For this scenario, the batten depth is 40 millimeters, the tile thickness is 10 millimeters, the roof pitch is 10 degrees, and the rafter left on dimension is 61 millimeters. So the formula is bracket, batten depth plus tile thickness, close bracket, divided by cos, roof pitch, which will be 10 degrees, plus rafter left on dimension. So the calculation is bracket, batten depth of 40 millimeters plus tile thickness of 10 millimeters, close bracket, divided by cos 10 plus 61 millimeters. This gives us a height above top plate of 111.8 millimeters, say 112 millimeters height above top plate. This example is for C height above top plate for a metal roof. You will need to know the batten depth, the amount of gap, which is 5 mm standard, the roof pitch, and the rafter left on dimension. So the formula is bracket batten depth minus 5 mm gap, close bracket, divided by cos roof pitch, which will be 10 degrees, plus rafter left on dimension. So the calculation is bracket batten depth of 40 mm minus 5 mm gap, close bracket, divided by cos 10 plus 61 mm left on. This gives us a height above top plate of 96.5 mm, say 97 mm. Determining eave drop off for a falling rafter tail. Now that we've calculated the initial drop off, fascia drop off, and height above top plate, we can determine the eave drop off, or X. The formula for eave drop off for a falling rafter tail is fall A plus bracket B minus C close bracket. We will calculate eave drop off for both the tiled roof and the metal roof that we looked at earlier. And because the fascia dimensions are the same, fall A initial drop off and B fascia drop off will be the same for both examples. But C, the height above top plate, will be different for the two examples. So if we complete the formula, fall A was 84 mm plus bracket fascia drop off was 160 mm minus height above top plate for tiled roof was 112 mm close bracket. That gives us an eave drop off of 132 mm for a tiled roof. And the next example is for metal roofing, and as I previously mentioned, because the eave width and the fascia dimensions are the same, the initial drop off and fascia drop off will also be the same. So fall A, initial drop off, is 84 mm again, and B, fascia drop off, is 160 mm again. But you'll notice this time that C is 97 mm. So if we complete the calculation, fall A, 84 mm plus bracket B, fascia drop off of 160 mm minus C, height above top plate, 97 mm close bracket, gives us an eave drop off of 147 mm. Now, if you're wondering why we have brackets in that formula and think that they're not necessary because of that calculation will work without them, you're absolutely correct. Fall A plus bracket B minus C close bracket would work even if those brackets didn't exist in that formula. However, for the next example where rafter tails rise away from the wall frame, the brackets are definitely necessary. So I've included these brackets just to keep the formulas consistent, and that way there's only one thing that is different with the formula, and that is rather than fall A, it is rise A, and rather than plus and then bracket, it's actually minus bracket. So in this formula for a rafter tail that falls from the frame, you've got an addition and then a subtraction. But for the next examples where we've got rafter tails that rise away from the frame, you've got two subtractions. And if the brackets didn't exist in this case, the calculation would be incorrect. So for the next examples, it is necessary to have the brackets, otherwise the formula won't work as it is intended. So just be mindful of the difference and the reason why those brackets exist. Now we're on to fascias that rise from the frame. In some instances, particularly on skillion roofs, you'll have to locate the fascia position at the high end of the roof, and in this instance it will be where the fascia rises away from the frame, or the rafter tail rises away from the frame. So there's some variation in the calculation, but there are also some similarities, so we'll have a look at those now. So the formula for rising rafter tail is rise A minus bracket B minus C and close bracket, and that'll give you the eave drop off for the fascia position for a rafter tail that rises away from the frame. So note there are some similarities with the formula, but where the previous formula had an addition, this has a subtraction. And what you'll also notice about this formula is that for B and C, they will be exactly the same as your calculations for the rafter tails that fall from the frame. So once you've determined that for the rafter tails that fall from the frame, you'll use those exact same dimensions for this calculation as well. Rise A will be different, and obviously there'll be a subtraction after that, but B and C will be exactly the same as the previous calculation for a rafter tail that falls from the frame. Rise A can be calculated with trigonometry also, and this calculation is based on the roof pitch, the eave width, and also the frame width. Rise A is different to fall A due to the addition of the frame width and not including the fascia thickness. So the calculation for rise A is similar to fall A, except one of the components that we use to calculate rise A is frame width. So the previous calculation for fall A, that would have been the fascia thickness, but in this case fascia thickness is replaced by frame width. So we must first add the eave width to the frame width, the eave width of 450 millimeters and the frame width of 70 millimeters. Adding those two together, we get 520 millimeters. So using the 520 millimeters, we apply it to our formula for tan, doing the same conversions as we did previously. And this time it would be 520 millimeters multiplied by tan 10, which gives us 91.7. So we would say 92 millimeter initial rise for rise A. And once you've determined rise A, you apply it to your formula. So it's rise A minus bracket B minus C close bracket, and that will give you the eave drop off, also known as X. And it's important to note for rising rafter tails, if X is a positive number, you measure up from the wall plate, but if X is a negative number, you would measure down from the wall plate. Now, using the information that we determined earlier for a tiled roof, we'll determine the eave drop off, or X, for a rising rafter tail. So the rise A being 92 millimeters, B being 160 millimeters, and C 112 millimeters. Calculating the brackets first, 160 minus 112 gives us 48. 92 minus 48 leaves 44. Being a positive number, you would then measure 44 millimeters up from the top plate to establish the height, and then level across to establish the position of your fascia. And again, for a metal roof, for a rafter tail that rises away from the frame, rise A again being 92, B 160, and C 97. Calculating the brackets first, 160 minus 97 leaves 63. 92 minus 63 is 29. So again, being a positive number, you would measure up from the top plate and level across to establish the position of your fascia. This is just a scenario to show what happens if you encounter a negative number. If the scenario produces a negative number, say if C was 60 millimeters, the following would apply. Rise A again being 92 millimeters, B 160, and C being 60 millimeters. This would produce an answer of negative 8 millimeters, and in this case you would measure down from the top plate, not up. So you would measure down from the top plate 8 millimeters and level across to establish the position of your fascia.